We are continuing in our series called Connect. And if you're just joining us, essentially what we are doing is looking at how we can connect our faith and our relationship with Jesus into every aspect of life. Where we take Jesus seriously when he said to his followers, listen, I will be with you always. I'll be with you always. You see, sometimes I think one of the challenges that we have in life is we live a disconnected life, or we live a segmented life, where we have various segments of life, and Jesus gets yet another segment of our lives, and we fail to see how we can incorporate him into every aspect. So we simply begin by recognizing that God is with us in the midst of every moment of life, and how that begins to shape and change our perspective, how that begins to change and shape our responses, whatever we may find ourselves in. But it's in holding to that truth that it's not simply an opportunity to kind of grow deeper in our faith and perhaps experience God in ways that we otherwise wouldn't have, but it also takes seriously the comment that Jesus makes at the end of his earthly ministry, before he is about to ascend into heaven, when he says to his disciples, he says to his followers, listen, this is the plan. I want you to go into all the world and make disciples. Or on another occasion, Jesus says, you will be my witnesses to the very ends of the earth. And I believe that one of the dangers we fall into is when within the Jesus compartment of our life, we make evangelism or witnessing another one of those compartments, that it's a program or that it's something that we sort of have to do. As opposed to taking Jesus at his word when saying, listen, if you're living all of life with me, then suddenly every opportunity, whatever circle of influence you find yourself in, that is your opportunity to be a witness. That is your opportunity to be a disciple. So Jesus is not simply reminding us, listen, I am with you always for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others. That how we begin to live life with God begins to blend into absolutely everything else. So if you're just joining us, one of the things we have been doing is looking intentionally at the various circles of life, the various places that God has put us, and to begin to see, okay, how do I experience God in the midst of this place? And how does this provide an opportunity for me to begin to be a witness for him? So last week we looked at that first circle of influence, that is of family. Regardless of where you are, regardless of whether you're married with kids, no kids, if you're widowed, if you're single, if you're divorced, if you have a blended family, wherever you find yourself in this stage of life, how are you experiencing God? How are you beginning to become a witness for him in this most immediate and direct circle of life? This morning we're going to expand it out a little bit. And we're going to look at a second circle of life. A circle of life where likely we spend a good majority of our time every day. And it's kind of one sort of catch-all word I'm going to describe, but let me define it after I say it. The aspect of work. Of work. Now, what I mean by work is not simply do you get a paycheck, not simply what title or status does it provide, but essentially, how do you spend the majority of your day? Some of you do go to a job. For some of you, you are retired, or you're a stay-at-home parent, or you are a student, or you are unemployed, or you are volunteered. The definition of work, when we look at it biblically, and we will in a few moments, is not whether or not you get paid, or whether or not you have a corner office, or whether or not you have a fancy title, but rather how is it that you spend the majority of your time. So this morning, we're going to look as intentionally as we can as to how do we begin to incorporate our faith into our work, into how we spend our day-to-day. And to set it up, we're going to show a video.
Work. Most of us spend over half our lives at work. Whatever it is you fill the 9 to 5 with, planting crops, building cars, taking care of patients, teaching students, or running a business, work is where most of life happens. For some, work is a drain. They dread Monday mornings, forcing themselves to struggle through because they need the paycheck, while many times feeling trapped and beaten down by their job. Some people love their work. They're good at what they do. It energizes them. It's a place of security, a place to chase dreams, desires, and success. At work, they find fulfillment. We often forget to connect our faith to our work. We don't consider the reasons God may have us at our job. We don't think about the purpose and meaning we could bring to our work. We simply focus on how it makes us feel. But what if we saw our work as an opportunity to worship? As Christians, we are called to serve Christ with our lives. For a few, that means working as a pastor, a youth minister, or a missionary. Others serve the church by teaching children or singing in the choir. But when Sunday is over, most of us return to our jobs outside the church. For us, our mission is in the marketplace. We may not be the kind of missionary who moves to the far regions of Africa, but around the conference table, around the water cooler, or around the cubicle, we have an opportunity to worship the God who created us. He gave us skill. He gave us passion. He gave us work. When we do our jobs with excellence and integrity and diligence, it's an act of worship. We are displaying God's craftsmanship to the non-believing world around us. We are earning the right to be heard. We don't see a divide between Sunday and Monday, between the sacred and the secular. We've been invited into parts of the world that a pastor or traditional missionary will never see. We have conversations with people who would never set foot in a church. Whether we love or dread our work, we choose to turn the focus away from ourselves and toward the mission God has for us. Church is not the only place we worship, and Sundays are not the only days on our calendars that have meaning. Every day on mission for God brings us great joy. Like the heroes before us, we can be modern-day Noahs and Josephs and Peters who are called with a purpose. God has designed us. He created us to work and to worship. For us, work is worship.
The line that kind of stuck me was the very last one. You know, work is worship. How we spend our time, what we end up doing becomes a part of our worship and our service of God. It begins to change the focus away from ourselves in terms of, well, how does my job make me feel as a determining factor, and begins to ask the question, okay, how can I use this opportunity that God has given to me, as He has placed me in this very specific place to serve Him? For some of you, as it was said, some of you probably love your job. It's a great thing you go to. It brings you great joy. It brings you great satisfaction. It provides wonderful meaning. For others, you may kind of sing the old song as you go, kind of, I owe, so off to work I go. I mean, it's just simply a reality. We got to pay the bills, so we got to do something. For others, the reality might be work is a dread. It's not something you look forward to. It's not something you really want to do. I did a little quick review this week in terms of Canadian business, in terms of those most sought-after jobs in the marketplace, those opportunities where people find seemingly the most satisfaction, they get reimbursed well, they have a good kind of environment. And I looked at some of them, and it was kind of interesting to see what were some of the top jobs according to Canadian Business Review. A financial manager was right up there. I guess it's more exciting to deal with other people's money than your own. Registered nurses is one of those sought-after jobs. Many of the trades, so electricians, plumbers, carpenters, those are sought after. A pharmacist, who would have thought? And I kind of worked through it, and chances are, within the first 100, many of the things that you do are in there. But the least satisfying job, according to this market research, was... Are there any telemarketers here? No? Okay. Was telemarketing, right? And I kind of get that, right? I mean, do you really want the job where you got to call up someone during their supper hour, interrupt them, be hung up on, maybe be yelled at? I mean, that's not exactly satisfying to have to do that. But as disturbing as that was, what was a little more disturbing, and I went through this list a couple of times, nowhere was it even mentioned a pastor. So I don't know if that puts me above or below a telemarketer, but anyways, I've slowly gotten over it. But what we begin to do is when we begin to connect our faith into all of life, if we start to connect our faith into work, again, whatever it is that you do, we begin to change our focus away from that entirety of saying, well, how does this make me feel? To what are the opportunities that God has given to me? So we're going to unpack this a little bit, and we're going to go to Scripture, and we're going to go to the writings of the Apostle Paul. Now Paul was both a tent maker and kind of a going to various places and teaching others about Jesus. And so much of the New Testament are these letters that have been written by the Apostle Paul. And what we see in a lot of the letters is Paul responding to specific questions or specific issues that followers of Jesus were facing. But that's not the case with the book of Romans. And if you have a Bible or you want to open up the Bible in the pew in front of you, we're going to go to Romans chapter 12 this morning. And Romans is set up in a rather interesting way because the very first 11 chapters of Romans, Paul is basically laying out in a very systematic way what it is that we believe as followers of Jesus. The first 11 chapters is essentially Paul telling the Christians what God has done for them. So this is what God has done. This is what we believe. This is what we hold on to. And then in chapter 12, there's a key transition word. And if you ever find this in the Bible, it's important not to overlook. It's the word therefore. Because now what Paul is doing is he is transitioning from what God has done into now how we are going to respond. So if you're going to divide Romans up, the first 11 chapters kind of deal with what it is we believe, what God has done. And then from chapter 12 on, it's now a matter of how is it that we are going to behave? How are we going to now live out our faith? And let's look and listen to where Paul lands us in chapter 12. I'm going to invite Peter to come up and read that passage for us here this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Romans 12, verses 1 to 8. May God guide our hearing of his word. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourselves with sober judgment, in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given us. If a man's gift is prophecy, let him use it in proportion to his faith. If it is serving, let him serve. If it is teaching, let him teach. If it is encouraging, let him encourage. If it is contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it is leadership, let him govern diligently. If it is showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully.
So Paul says, in view of everything that God has done for you, this is what we can do. We can give our lives, we can give our bodies back as an act of worship. This is what God wants. This is what is pleasing to God. Again, getting away from that sense of a disconnect of, well, God, I will give you this day at this time, and we'll do these different things. And God is saying, no. I want to be a part of every aspect of life. That is what is pleasing to me. And I think it's one of the dangers we fall into is we begin to look at these passages and we look at some of the different gifts that Paul talks about, and we suddenly think, okay, what area of the church am I going to serve with those gifts in, and what am I going to do, and how's this going to look? As opposed to, I think, taking Paul at his word and saying, okay, no. Look at where you are at already. And how do you begin to incorporate this into all of life? You see, Paul is saying you don't simply have to go to a certain building on a certain day to worship God. You can do it every day and in every place. Now, kind of the backdoor question to that is, okay, well then why do we bother with church? I mean, why do we bother showing up on a specific day at a specific place? That is a very good question, which I'm not going to answer today. We're going to deal with that in a couple of weeks as to why we even bother coming to church. So guess what? To find the answer why you got to come to church, you got to come to church. That's just brilliant logic, isn't it? Got to keep you coming for something. But it's this opportunity for us to begin to see, okay, how does every other aspect of life begin to play into my faith? And Paul gets specific. And that's what I appreciate about Paul is he kind of makes this lofty statement. And we could look at this and say, okay, all of life is worship. Everything I can give back to God is an act of faith. But okay, what does that start to look like? And so in verses 4 to 6, Paul begins to break it down even further. He says, we don't all have the same function. Now, that word that Paul is using, when you kind of tease it out a little bit, it's defined by essentially function is that which we habitually do day after day after day. What does that start to sound like? Work. Paul is saying we all have different functions. We all have different opportunities to work. We all have different gifts. We have the same purpose, but we have different functions. So find out, what is your function? Find out where you are. Find out what your gifts are, and then begin to ask the question, how can I use this opportunity that God has given to me? Whether going to a job, whether with family, whether retired, whether staying at home, whether in school, to serve God in the midst of all of life. It begins to make sense when Jesus says, you need to go into all the world, into various places, into various situations. Now think about it. If we all had the same function, if we all had the same gifts, it wouldn't work out so well. I mean, if we were all doctors, or we were all lawyers, or we were all tradespeople, or heaven forbid, we were all pastors, that wouldn't play out so well. Because we'd all be in the same place trying to do the same thing. God has gifted us in amazing ways. God has positioned all of you in incredible places to carry out his work. And if we were all doing the same thing in the same place, it just simply wouldn't work out. But one of the unhelpful things that we have done, and it's happened over history, is that we have made certain gifts, certain jobs, certain functions more important than others. We speak about gifts not as being specific, but rather as special. And I think within the church, we don't do a good job of this. We talk about pastors or we talk about missionaries, people who go overseas, and those people are really doing the work of God. Biblically, it's not anywhere found. What actually began to happen was in about the 4th century when suddenly there was a creation of clergy. They suddenly thought, well, wait a second here. We're gonna create a hierarchy, and those are people who are called. Everyone else just kind of goes to a job. Have you ever heard that language? You know, if you're in ministry, you're called, but you all just go to work. It's not helpful. We are all called to do the work of ministry. Where we do that is dependent upon our gifts and abilities. And so whether I'm up here talking to you, and there's a little bit of irony in all of this, right? That I work in the church and kind of work here, and I'm telling you and giving you advice as to how to go into your workplace where I'm not at. I mean, I have a captive audience for most cases. But it's this idea that we are called to offer our bodies back to God, to be witnesses for Him, and how that plays out is into wherever we spend our day by day by day. So it's not a matter of what gifts I have or what gifts I don't have. Do you notice when Jesus talked about the parable of the talents, He didn't get up on people because of how many talents they had or didn't have. He was more concerned about how did you use the talents, the gifts that had been given to you. So what do we start to do? Paul breaks it down even further. From verses 6 to 8, it's like Paul is getting very specific. He says, okay, this is the idea. Worship God wherever you are. We all have different functions. Now I'm going to break it down. Some of you have the gifts of serving. Some of you have the gifts of teaching. Some of you have the gift of encouraging. Some of you have the gifts of prophecy. Some of you have the gift of mercy. He's like, figure out what gifts you have and then do it. Don't worry about what you don't have. Figure out what you do have and then begin to work it out. But again, we may look at these and we may think, okay, well, how can I work this out in the midst of the life of the church? And I think what we're missing is the bigger point, is a lot of those functions are played out in day-to-day realities of where you go to work. So I did a little thinking this past week as to how some of these functions, some of these gifts would actually play out in the day-to-day marketplace. And this is what I came up with. Serving. Paul says if you have the gift of serving, then serve. So, I don't know, maybe if you are a volunteer somewhere, or if you work in a restaurant, or you work behind a counter. I mean, in the service industry is a pretty big industry. If you work in tourism, Paul is saying if you have that gift of service, then serve others. What about teaching? Well, I mean, if you're a teacher, if you're a professor, if you're a trainer, if you're in those types of places, Paul is saying, use those gifts. Teach others. If you have the gift of encouragement, so if you're a counselor, or if you are a coach, or you find yourself in various other opportunities, then use that gift of encouragement. Prophecy. That's a tougher one. Meteorologist? I mean, they're kind of taking a swing at it. Or we move on. If you have contributing to the needs of others, and I love this one, contributing to the needs of others, be generous. Okay? So every other one, he says, if you have the gift of serving, then serve. Teach, then teach. But for this one, he says, if you have the gift of contributing to the needs of others, be generous. So for me, those are the categories like IT, or the medical profession, or tradespeople. If you're a tradesperson and you deal with people like me who have no ability to fix anything, be generous. It's in the Bible. Last two, leadership. Be diligent. If you're in government, if you're a manager, if you own your own business, you need to be diligent. You need to lead well. And then finally, if you have the gift of mercy, be cheerful. What occupations have the gift of mercy? Judges, police officers, physical trainers. I mean, they need the gift of mercy more than anyone else. But we begin to see the reality of how does this play out. And as I started to look through this, sometimes we look at the various opportunities and begin to say, okay, what has God gifted me with? Where has God placed me? And now what is my opportunity to serve Him in the midst of what I am doing? You know, for me, it was more of a process of elimination. You know, I kind of came to where I am here today by kind of figuring out things that, you know, I'm not very good at, and why would I spend a career doing it? Because it would just be frustrating and a disaster for everyone involved. You've heard me speak at length about my inability to fix things, so the area of trades just never kind of went out the door. Numbers, I wasn't great at numbers, and I would actually argue that most pastors don't have the gift of numbers for two reasons. One is we always overestimate how many people come to something, and we always underestimate how long we actually spoke for. So I've only been going for about 5 minutes, I would think, right? I pass out at the sight of blood, so medical profession, not a good idea. And it goes on and on. And so, but then suddenly you start to see yourself, and it's not a matter of, what job must I do, but rather, what can I do to serve God? You see, a lot of times we may find ourselves in a place, and if you're a student or if you're kind of between jobs and you're wondering, what should I do next? Or a great promotion comes or a new opportunity comes, and you start to ask the question, well, does God really want me to do that? And we can put a whole bunch of stress on ourselves, but look bigger picture. God is less concerned about what we do, is more concerned about how we do it. I'm not going to go into detail, but clearly there's probably some professions that God wouldn't be happy in if we went into. But for the most part, wherever we find ourselves serving, if we do it with the opportunity to serve God, then that is what brings him great pleasure. So we begin to be a witness. And this is a theme that is picked up throughout Paul's writings. He doesn't only say it to the Christians in Rome. He says it to the Christians in Colossae. He says it to the Christians in Ephesus. He says, whatever you do, whatever you do it for God. That is what brings him pleasure. So what's our takeaway here this morning? Come back to this one verse. When Paul says, don't conform to the patterns of this world. Don't fall in line with what the world is telling you. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You see, when we begin to conform to the patterns of this world, we think that we have to go after the jobs that will pay the most, that will give the best titles, that will give us a great amount of status. That suddenly we begin to find our worth in our work. And it's not. It's found in our relationship with God. It's found in how we live life with him. But if we continue to strive and to find our identity in the things of this world, and work is a pretty good idol to do that, we stray further and further away from truly living all of life with God. The second thing we begin to do is I've had an interesting experience these past probably 2 months now, and a number of the staff has, is we've had a co-op student working with us. And he's wanting to consider becoming a pastor, so I'm doing my best not to discourage him. All right, I'm doing my best. So I have him hang out with Stephanie and Shane and Chuck and other people. But for me, it's been a real test I have to kind of speak things through, and I'm aware of him being there. I have to kind of explain things and talk about things. I'm sure you've all had the opportunity, maybe you've gone as a child or you've been there as a parent where you take your child to work day and you kind of show them around and you talk to them about what you're doing and you do different things. What if you kind of in your own mind had like every day a take Jesus to work day? How would that begin to change things? How would that begin to change your perspective? How would that begin to change how you'd have that conversation about your boss who's a real pain? Or about the coworker who doesn't pull their own weight? Or about the frustrations that you have at home? It begins to change the perspective. Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Because one thing that I'm learning more and more is faith. Relationship with Jesus is something that is caught. It's not simply taught. Right? We can tell people. But if you read through the Gospels, there's always this incredible fascination with Jesus. That before he really says anything, he's done something, and people are fascinated by him. And he's caught their attention. When Jesus says, go into all the world and make disciples, he is saying, I am going to place you in specific places that you may feel are dead-end jobs. And Jesus says, I want you there. I want to see how you can be used in the midst of the whatevers of life so that people can catch a glimpse of me. It changes our perspective. It's not necessarily about becoming busier. It's not simply about looking at our gifts and thinking, oh, I wish I had this gift, I wish I had that gift. It's about saying, God, what have you given to me? God, where have you placed me? And how can I work with such excellence, diligence, and integrity that people will begin to catch hold of who you are in my life? It's Sunday, and Monday's around the corner. We have the opportunity to begin this week to live life with God in the midst of work, whatever work may be for you. Please stand as we sing together.